Right after the battle against Washington, something began to hang in the air, a strange feeling, almost impossible to ignore. It was as if a shadow had fallen over the team and its fans. Out of nowhere, an unpredictable piece of news exploded and shook everyone. A key part of the offense suddenly sidelined, with no clues, no warning signs, nothing in practice, nothing during the game, nothing that could prepare the fan base for a blow like that. And when that bomb dropped, it felt like a test for those who truly believe. A sharp, heavy hit, the kind that forces anyone to face reality head-on. But it's exactly in moments like these that we see the strength of the Blue and Silver Nation. So go ahead and smash that like button to support the video, especially if you've been a Lions fan since the days of the legendary Barry Sanders. Let's get started. When you dig into what actually happened on the field, though, you start to see where the concern comes from. On the play the medical staff believes caused the issue, Laporta is dragging multiple defenders the way he always does, refusing to go down, legs driving, balance steady, doing everything that made him one of the toughest tight ends in the league to bring down. But that effort left him exposed, and that's when Washington's number 99 came crashing in. The hit wasn't dirty, but it was direct and violent, helmet straight into the middle of Laporta's thoracic spine. One of those impacts you watch in slow motion and instantly feel how much force travels through the body. And even though he tried to push through it, even though he may have convinced himself in the moment that he was fine, the truth is injuries like that don't always reveal themselves right away. From the medical perspective described in the file, the spine is a complicated structure of bone, ligaments, nerves, and joints, and when you absorb trauma right through the middle of it, a lot can go wrong that isn't obvious on first evaluation. A bone bruise, for example, isn't just a bruise the way fans think of it. It's inflammation inside the bone itself, and sometimes it lasts longer than an actual fracture. There are also structural concerns like partial non-displaced fractures, ligament disruption, nerve irritation, or the early stages of spondylolisthesis, where the vertebrae begin to shift out of alignment. When that happens, the nerves connected to that area shift too, and suddenly pain can radiate down the back or the legs, the kind of symptoms the medical staff considers red flag territory. What makes Laporta's case even trickier is that he might have continued playing through it initially. The swelling and inflammation that follow these kinds of impacts can take 24 to 72 hours to appear, and by the time everything tightens up and the blood pockets form, the severity becomes much clearer. That's likely why what looked like nothing on game day has turned into a long-term concern. As the file notes, once the imaging came in and the doctors had a clearer sense of the internal damage, it became obvious he needed more than rest between practices. He needed real recovery time, possibly 4 to 6 weeks, maybe even 8 depending on how the internal bruising responds. And the Lions, looking at where the season is headed, seem determined not to rush him. This isn't an ankle or shoulder injury you tape up and manage. This is the spine. One wrong move can turn a mild injury into something that threatens a career. But that brings us to what matters to fans the most. What does this mean for the offense? Because losing Laporta isn't just losing a tight end. It's losing one of the engines of the unit, a player who drags defenders, extends drives, blocks at a high level, and provides a safety valve that makes the entire passing game function more smoothly. And as the file points out, you could see in the Philly game how much the offense missed him. The timing wasn't the same. The creativity in the middle of the field wasn't the same. Detroit now has to find ways to operate without one of its most versatile weapons, and while the remaining schedule is more favorable, it still requires adaptation. The staff knows it, the coaches know it, and the players undoubtedly feel it too. The flip side of this, though, is that the team seems confident Laporta will return. The medical team in the file leans toward a recovery window rather than anything surgical. They emphasize that he's tough, that he's a horse, and that once the inflammation clears, he should be able to push again. It's the kind of injury where careful management now prevents bigger problems later, and with Detroit expecting to be in the postseason, preserving him for that stretch becomes the priority. The real challenge is making sure he doesn't try to push through it too early, the way many athletes do, risking a setback because they don't want to miss time or lose their spot. But in this case, the doctors seem to be pulling him back intentionally, making the decision for him so he doesn't aggravate an injury that needs patience, not adrenaline. All this leads to the bigger question hanging over the fan base right now. Knowing how vital Laporta is, how does this change your expectations for the stretch run, and do you believe the Lions can maintain their rhythm on offense while he heals? Picking up right where we left off, the conversation around Sam Laporta's injury becomes even more layered when you look at how the coaches and medical staff view the next several weeks. With Detroit entering what should be the more manageable portion of its schedule, the organization appears to be operating with the mindset that protecting Laporta now is the only way to guarantee he's available when the games mean the most. And that tells you a lot about both the seriousness of the injury and how large his role is within this offense. Teams don't hold back players this critical unless the risk of worsening the condition is real, especially when we're talking about the spine, where any added instability could affect everything from movement to long-term health. When you listen closely to the explanations given in the attached file, it becomes clear that this wasn't a situation where Laporta simply got hit, felt some discomfort, and the trainers overreacted. This was the kind of trauma that can actually evolve and worsen over time. The inflammation, the internal bleeding within the bone, the pressure on surrounding nerves, all of this can intensify dramatically in the days following impact. And if the vertebrae shift or the ligaments stretch even slightly, it can create instability that an elite athlete simply can't play through without risking something far more serious. That's why the medical staff is being extremely quiet publicly, not because they're hiding something, but because injuries in this area can be complicated and unpredictable until the inflammation settles enough to get clearer imaging. And for fans who are wondering whether the hit itself was unusually damaging, the explanation from the experts really paints the picture. Laporta was bent forward, dragging multiple Washington defenders, with his back completely unprotected. When number 99 came in helmet first to the mid-back, all that force traveled into a spine that was already under strain. That combination, vulnerability, impact angle, compression, makes these injuries far more severe. And the truth is, the toughness Laporta is known for probably worked against him here. A player less determined to fight for every inch might have gone down earlier and avoided the blind shot entirely. What stands out most from the medical discussion in the file is how easily athletes can mistake this kind of injury for something they can shake off. The experts describe how inflammation can take up to 72 hours to fully set in, how pain can intensify once blood pockets form around the injury site, how nerve irritation may start subtly but then grow rapidly. That delayed escalation is exactly why a player might think he's fine, only to realize days later that something is seriously wrong. And once those red flags appear, pain radiating down the leg, inability to bear weight normally, numbness, or worsening stiffness, the medical staff steps in immediately, because those are signs the spine itself is compromised. That leads us into how Detroit adjusts in his absence, and the reality is, Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson are now being forced to reshape parts of the offense to account for the missing production. Laporta isn't just a route runner or a blocker, he's a matchup nightmare, a chain mover, a guy who creates yards after contact and draws safety attention that opens up the entire middle of the field. Without him, the Lions have to get more creative with formations, rely more heavily on their depth, and possibly even alter some of their running game tendencies. And while the schedule softens, that doesn't erase the need for consistent production. Every game matters for playoff seeding, confidence, and continuity, especially for an offense that struggled without him against Philadelphia. Still, there's optimism buried in all of this. The experts in the file stress that this appears to be a recovery-based injury, not a surgical one. The timeline is long enough to be inconvenient, but short enough to keep the door open for a meaningful return. They describe Laporta as someone who heals quickly, someone physically built to withstand heavy punishment, someone who, once cleared, can ramp back up rapidly. But the biggest point they repeatedly emphasize is that he cannot be rushed. Not even a little. Not even if he feels 80 or 85%. The Lions need the playoff version of Sam Laporta, not the mid-season version trying to get out a spine injury that could flare up again at the worst time. So here's where you come in, because this is the moment where fan expectations start to shape the conversation. With everything we know now, with the team choosing long-term health over short-term urgency, and with Laporta likely targeting a return closer to the postseason than the regular season, do you believe the Lions can stay balanced, disciplined, and effective enough to hold strong until he's back? Picking up from exactly where we left off, the reality is that the Lions now enter a stretch where their identity is being tested just as much as their depth. Losing a player like Sam Laporta doesn't just create a statistical gap, it creates an emotional one. He's one of those rare young players whose presence changes the attitude of an offense. He drags defenders, he refuses to go down, he converts plays that should be short gains into momentum-shifting moments. When he's not out there, everyone feels it, and you could see that in the Philadelphia game where the entire rhythm of the offense tightened without his reliability in the middle of the field. That's the challenge Detroit is staring down now. How do you maintain your aggressive rhythm while one of the engines of your offense recovers? The timeline discussed by the medical staff in the file lays out something very specific. This is not an injury that responds to grit, pain tolerance, or adrenaline. This is an injury that responds only to rest and stabilization. When you're dealing with a bone bruise in the spine, or a potential partial fracture, or ligaments and nerves irritated by swelling. Pushing through it doesn't toughen the injury, it worsens it. The experts compare it to injuries that remain deceptively quiet at first and then flare into something significantly more concerning in the days after impact. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here. Laporta likely felt tightness, maybe a sharp jolt, but believed he could shake it off. But once the inflammation and blood pockets formed, once things started shifting and pressing where they shouldn't, the true severity made itself known. That's why the Lions' tone right now is all about caution and long-term thinking. There's no talk of surgery, which is an encouraging sign, but there's also no attempt to minimize what he's dealing with. The medical staff is taking the approach of controlling the situation before it controls them. They've seen what happens when players push through spinal injuries, and it rarely ends well. And with Detroit positioned for a postseason run, they're making it clear they want the best version of Sam Laporta in the playoffs, not the compromised version trying to survive Week 11 or Week 12. It's the right call, even if it forces the offense to evolve on the fly. And that evolution is now one of the biggest storylines of the season. Ben Johnson is known for creative solutions, but replacing Laporta's combination of toughness, route precision, blocking leverage, and yards after contact ability is something you don't simply scheme around. You adapt. You adjust your personnel packages. You shift responsibilities to receivers, running backs, and complementary tight ends. You tweak your play sequencing. And most importantly, you ask your leaders to elevate their games. This is where Jared Goff's timing and command come into focus. This is where the offensive line's discipline becomes even more important. This is where the coaching staff leans on structure, communication, and detail. Laporta's absence forces everyone else to tighten their execution. The medical staff in the file describes something critical that fans sometimes overlook. When a player has pain radiating down the back or legs, or can't bear weight evenly, or feels numbness or tingling, those are red flags. Those are the conditions where the body is signaling danger, not discomfort. And when that happens in the spine, you simply don't gamble with it. That's why the team is being protective, even if Laporta's instinct is probably to push as soon as he feels remotely capable. The experts even emphasize that many athletes make things worse by trying to ignore pain out of fear of losing their spot. But this staff isn't playing that game. They're making the decision for him, preserving the long term over the short term, and that tells you how seriously they're treating this. At the same time, there's a strong sense of optimism from the medical analysis. They repeatedly highlight that this seems like a recover and wait injury, not a structural collapse. No one is suggesting surgery. No one is using language associated with season-ending repairs. They believe this will heal, and that once the inflammation settles and the alignment stabilizes, Laporta can return with full strength and confidence. That's the key, confidence, because when the spine is involved, even after the pain fades, the mental side of the injury becomes just as important. Trusting your body again, trusting that you can take a hit, trusting that bending, twisting, blocking, sprinting, and absorbing impact won't cause another flare-up. Those hurdles are real, and the Lions want him to clear them once, not twice. So now Detroit leans on its depth, its coaching, and its identity as they push through this stretch. The playoffs are still in front of them, and the runway is there for Laporta to return at the perfect moment. But the team has to earn that moment by staying disciplined and consistent until he's back. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. With everything we now understand about the injury, the timeline, and the team's approach, how confident are you that Detroit can stay strong and keep momentum alive until Laporta returns? Continuing exactly from where we left off, the next phase of this story becomes less about the injury itself and more about how the Lions respond to adversity that hits at an uncomfortable time in the season. Because if there's one thing the file made clear, it's that the medical staff fully expects Sam Laporta to recover, but recovery and readiness are two very different things in the NFL. Even once the inflammation fades and the imaging looks clean, even once he's pain-free and functional, the process of returning to collision-level football requires a progression that can't be rushed. It's not like flipping a switch. It's relearning trust in the exact part of the body that took the worst of the damage, and the Lions know that the wrong kind of hurry can undo weeks of progress. And that's the fascinating storyline developing inside Allen Park right now. Coaches are preparing the offense for a stretch where they have to win without one of their most important players, while simultaneously preparing for the moment he eventually returns. That means the playbook isn't shrinking, it's morphing. Formations that relied heavily on Laporta's presence get reworked. Motion packages get adjusted. Route combinations are rewritten to lean on players who were previously secondary options. The staff isn't trying to replace Laporta, because you can't replace him, but instead redistributing his responsibilities in ways that keep the system functional without forcing anyone into a role they can't fill. And here's where leadership comes into play in a huge way. With Laporta sidelined, the locker room naturally looks toward the players who set the tone, the veterans who understand the stakes, the guys who have lived through injuries, winning streaks, slumps, and pressure games. Those voices matter now more than ever. You can feel the weight shift toward players who recognize the difference between surviving a stretch and controlling it, because this isn't about treading water until Laporta returns. It's about maintaining the identity of a physical, disciplined, aggressive football team even while missing a key piece of that identity. Something else the file alludes to, though indirectly, is how easily a spine injury can cause compensation throughout the body. That is a huge reason why the staff is being protective. If Laporta tried to practice too early and altered his mechanics, even slightly, he could overload his hips, legs, or core. That kind of chain reaction is responsible for a lot of secondary injuries players deal with after coming back too soon. And when you consider how explosive and physical Laporta's playing style is, the staff understands that returning at anything less than full stability puts him at risk of another setback. So even if he starts to feel good, even if the pain disappears, the Lions will hold him back until he is genuinely ready, not just willing. Still, the optimism around his eventual return is real. The file emphasizes that there's no talk of surgical intervention, no signs of structural instability that would threaten his long-term career, and no medical indicators suggesting permanent damage if handled properly. That's the encouraging part. The injury is painful, it's disruptive, and it threatens his regular season availability, but it isn't the kind of injury that alters the trajectory of a player's future when managed correctly. And that's why the team is investing so heavily in caution now, because the playoffs are still very much in the picture, and the Lions want their tight end healthy, confident, and fully functional for the biggest games of the year. This brings us to the emotional side of things, which fans often feel long before players admit it publicly. When a player like Laporta goes down, it forces everyone around him to mentally reset. Coaches lose a piece of their weekly plan. Receivers are asked to carry more of the load across the middle. Running backs get more involved in the passing game. The quarterback has to adjust his timing and trust with the replacements. And the defense, even though they play on the other side of the ball, understands they may be asked to control games and stretches where the offense needs time to recalibrate. That's the hallmark of good teams, complementary football when adversity hits. What we're seeing now is whether Detroit can become that kind of team consistently. The injury doesn't define them, the response does. And that's why these next games matter so much. Not just for wins, not just for playoff positioning, but for proving that this team can adapt when one of its most important pieces is temporarily removed. Because make no mistake, when Sam Laporta returns, the offense becomes more dangerous, more flexible, and more physically imposing. And if the Lions can keep their momentum until then, his return won't just stabilize the offense, it could elevate it to another level entirely when the stakes are highest. With all that said, now it's your turn once again. Do you think the Lions can not only survive but stay explosive and dangerous while Laporta works his way back to full strength? And if you're feeling confident, what gives you the most faith in this team's ability to weather the storm? If you're enjoying this coverage, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, drop a like to push this video out to more Lions fans, and check out the videos now appearing on your screen for more breakdowns and updates. Continuing directly from where we left off, the situation surrounding Sam Laporta's recovery has now shifted from immediate concern to long-term planning. Inside the building, the Lions aren't just treating this as a temporary inconvenience, they're studying every angle, every timeline, every adaptation the offense needs to make while waiting for one of its most versatile weapons to return. And the deeper you go into how the medical staff described his condition in the file, the more you realize this isn't about managing soreness or keeping him comfortable. This is about ensuring structural stability in one of the most sensitive areas of the body before he's cleared for full impact football again. What stands out in the medical analysis is how clearly they describe the difference between a routine injury and one that requires serious patience. A thoracic spine issue, especially one involving potential bone bruising or partial fracture, isn't like a muscle pull where an athlete can test it with light reps and slowly build up. Every hit, every twist, every load transfer through the core puts stress on the spine. That's why inflammation has to be completely controlled before Laporta can even think about real football movements. Even the slightest lingering instability could trigger nerve pain, muscle compensation, or secondary injuries that would derail not only his season but potentially the postseason as well. And that's why the staff is treating this window as an investment. The longer the healing now, the the stronger the return later. Meanwhile, the coaching staff is taking the opportunity to challenge the roster. Without Laporta's physicality and explosiveness, Detroit's offense has to explore its depth and creativity. The beauty of Ben Johnson's system is that it's designed to maximize whoever is on the field, but Laporta represents a unique combination of attributes that can't simply be redistributed with a one-for-one replacement. Instead, Detroit is leaning into layered adjustments, more diversified route combinations, different tight end usage, heavier reliance on backs in the passing game, and increased pressure on wide receivers to win the intermediate areas Laporta often dominated. These aren't panic adjustments. They're strategic shifts rooted in confidence that this offense can remain dangerous even without its young star. At the same time, players are treating this stretch as a proving ground, not in a showboating sense, but in the way veteran locker rooms respond when adversity hits the wrong player at the wrong time. Leaders are gathering younger teammates, correcting details in practice, reinforcing tempo, stressing execution. Everyone understands that great teams don't collapse when one pillar is removed. They reinforce the structure until the pillar returns, and that mentality becomes contagious. The energy changes, the urgency ramps up, the standard tightens. These aren't cliches, they're the characteristics of teams that survive storms instead of being swallowed by them. The medical side of the story also provides one crucial layer of optimism. There's no indication in the file that this is a season-altering or career-altering injury. No one is talking about surgical intervention. No one is hinting at long-term damage. Everything described points toward a recovery timeline that hinges on patience, not fear. That's why every sign suggests Laporta will be back, and when he returns, he'll be physically ready, not just hurried back onto the field. The goal isn't for him to survive the rest of the season. The goal is for him to impact the biggest games of the year at full force. And that's where the hope really takes shape, because we've already seen what this offense looks like at full strength. We've seen how Laporta changes defensive coverages, how he forces linebackers to widen, how safeties hesitate when he streaks up the seam, how his ability to drag defenders sets the tone for the entire unit. His return won't just give Detroit another option, it will restore an entire layer of the offense that defenses have struggled to contain since the moment he stepped onto the field. So as the Lions work through this stretch, one thing becomes clear: this isn't just survival mode. This is preparation for a moment when the team regains one of its most dynamic weapons just as the stakes reach their highest point. And if Detroit can maintain momentum until that moment arrives, Laporta's return could feel less like a recovery and more like the spark that ignites a dangerous playoff run.